In this section, I demonstrate numerous ways to set up your shooting takedowns using strikes. If you plan on competing in MMA and want to bring the fight to the mat, this is a mandatory skill to possess. While in a wrestling match, it is possible to shoot in from a distance without suffering negative consequences. This does not hold true for MMA. When you don't set up your shots, your opponent can spot your takedown from a mile away and employ a counter. Sometimes he will sprawl and drop his weight on top of you, putting you in a compromising position, and other times he will halt your takedown using strikes, such as a knee to the face. Neither outcome is optimal. However, when you set up your takedowns using strikes aimed at your opponent's head, you pull his focus away from defending his legs and momentarily blind him. As long as you understand which strikes set up which takedowns the best, you can immediately drop your level, shoot past your opponent's defenses, and obtain control of his legs. Although there are dozens of different striking/takedown combinations you can build, I have included the ones that have worked best for me. After learning these options, I recommend experimenting to discover what works best for you. However, it is important to remember this general rule. When in opposite fighting stances with your opponent, his lead leg will be positioned close to your lead hand, making single leg takedowns your best option. When in the same fighting stance, his lead leg will be positioned away from your lead arm, making double leg takedowns your best option. There are of course takedown combinations that break this rule, but in the beginning, following these guidelines will allow you to make the most advancement. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to utilize a jab-cross combination to set up a double leg takedown when you and your opponent are in the same fighting stance, meaning you have the same foot forward. The idea is to throw the jab-cross with enough power to distract and threaten your opponent. As his focus and guard shifts upwards to protect his head, I step my rear foot to the outside of his rear foot, drop my level by lowering my hips, and place my right ear against his right rib cage. As a rule of thumb, always position your head to the opposite side of your penetration leg. In this example, I step forward with the right leg, so I position my head on the right side of my opponent's body. Once I've closed the distance, I do several things to finalize the takedown. First, I squeeze my head tight against his rib cage. Not only does this protect me from getting caught in a guillotine choke, but it also allows me to drive his body laterally using my head. Second, I grab my opponent's legs behind his knees. This prevents him from stepping backwards, sprawling, and stuffing my shot by dropping his weight down on top of me. Continuing to block my opponent's legs and drive him laterally using my head, he collapses over my right leg. Once on the mat, I move my hips and legs in a clockwise direction and establish side control. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to utilize a knee block takedown when you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances. To begin, I step my lead foot forward into the outside of my opponent's lead leg, giving me a dominant angle of attack. As I land the punch, my opponent's focus and guard raises upward to protect his face, making his legs vulnerable to attack. Immediately after landing the cross, I step my rear foot to the outside of his rear foot, drop my level by lowering my hips, drive forward into his body, and chop my right hand into the back of his left knee to disrupt his base and balance. With my opponent's left leg partially collapsed, my goal is to turn his body and shift all of his weight onto his left leg. To accomplish this, instead of retracting my left arm after throwing the cross, I slide it across his body and underneath his right arm, establishing a deep underhook. To score the takedown, I circle around my opponent in a clockwise direction and drive him in the same direction using my left underhook. As his body turns, I continue to chop my right hand into the back of his left knee. Unable to stop his rotation, his weight shifts onto his weakened left leg, causing him to collapse to the mat. One of the best aspects of this technique is that it puts your opponent on his back and leaves you standing, which allows you to either begin striking him from the standing position or begin passing his guard into a more dominant position. In this scenario, I demonstrate how to set up a high single variation using a cross when you and your opponent are standing in opposite fighting stances. To begin, I step my lead leg to the outside of my opponent's lead leg and throw across. Next, I hook my right arm around the back of his left knee, clasp my hands together, and pull his leg up to my chest. This gives me the high single position. There are many takedowns that can be executed from here, but because my opponent has kept his trapped leg to the outside of my rear leg, I decide to utilize a scooping throw, which is somewhat unorthodox. To prevent him from stepping back and avoiding the takedown, I unclasp my hands, wrap my right arm around his back, and clasp his right hip using my right hand. Next, I pull up on his trapped leg using my left hand, and then while it is elevated, I quickly scoop my left arm underneath his trapped left leg. This allows me to clasp my hands together over his left hip. To execute the takedown from my new body positioning, I step my right foot behind me and rotate my body in a clockwise direction. With my opponent's body attached to mine, my downward pressure and clockwise rotation pulls him downward and in a clockwise direction. Unable to step his right foot behind him to re-establish his base due to my control, he has no choice but to collapse to his back. The nice part about this technique is that instead of landing in my opponent's guard, I land with the cradle position in side control, which will allow me to immediately get my offense going. In this sequence, I demonstrate another way to set up the high single when you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances, and then show an alternate version for completing the takedown. Instead of throwing a strike at my opponent's face, I open my hands and throw them both forward, which is often referred to as a hand bump. This technique comes in handy when you want to distract your opponent, but he already has his guard elevated, and you don't want to risk punching his elbows and injuring your hand. Just as when I set up takedowns with actual punches, I step my lead foot to the outside of my opponent's lead leg. Next, I drop my level, hook my right arm around the outside of my opponent's left hamstring, and hook my left hand around the inside of his left ankle. This not only allows me to pull his leg upward into my chest, but also straighten his leg. To execute the takedown, I simply take a quick step backwards and drive my opponent in a clockwise direction using my head. Unable to maintain his balance when presented with both my lateral and circular movement, he falls to his back. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a throw when you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances. To set it up, I step my lead foot to the outside of my opponent's lead leg and throw across at his face. With my opponent rattled, I rotate my hips and shoulders in a counterclockwise direction and throw a lead hook to his jaw. However, instead of pulling my arm back into my stance after the hook lands, I follow through with it so that my arm moves in front of my opponent's body. Once accomplished, I set up the takedown by stepping my right leg behind my opponent's legs, dropping my level, hooking my left arm around the back of his left leg, and hooking my right arm around the front of his legs. From this position, my opponent is helpless. He can't step backwards due to my right leg. He can't step to his right because I'm controlling his right leg using my right hand. He also can't move towards me because my body is blocking him. To complete the takedown, all I have to do is twist my torso slightly in a clockwise direction. This drives my right arm into his stomach, which in turn causes him to trip backwards over my right leg. As he falls to his back, I go down with him, land in side control, and cradle his top leg to maintain control of his body. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute the previous technique when you and your opponent are in the same fighting stance. The difference is the setup. As you have learned, stepping your lead foot to the outside of your opponent's lead foot is an excellent way to set up a takedown when you are in opposite fighting stances because your opponent's lead leg is close to your lead hand, which makes scooping up his leg an easy task. When you are in the same fighting stance, his lead leg is positioned farther away from your lead hand. As a result, you are generally limited to shooting in for double leg takedowns or crossbody single leg type takedown. However, you do have the option of switching your stance upon entry, which allows you to once again employ the outside single leg scoop shown here. With my opponent's power hand reversed in this scenario, I lead with a jab to avoid moving into a powerful punch. With my opponent's vision temporarily blurred, that's when I rotate my hips in a clockwise direction and throw across. Instead of pulling my arm back into my stance after landing the cross, I slide it in front of his body. I also use the clockwise rotation generated from the cross to drop my level and step my rear foot forward and behind my opponent's legs. Once accomplished, I wrap my left arm around the outside of his left leg and hook my right arm around the outside of his right leg. To complete the takedown, I rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction, increase my elevation, lift his legs, and dump him backwards to the mat. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to set up and execute an inside trip when you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances. An excellent time to employ this technique is when you're up against an experienced competitor who refuses to let you step to the outside of his lead leg and acquire a dominant angle of attack. Although this can make it difficult to complete some of the takedowns previously shown, it sets you up perfectly for the inside trip. For the setup, I like to throw a jab and then a cross. Immediately after the cross lands, I step my rear foot up to my lead foot so that my body is balanced, and then quickly hook my lead leg around the inside of my opponent's lead leg and wrap my arms around his body. Since I don't have great control over his body, I quickly execute the takedown by driving my hips into his body and pulling his lead leg off the mat using my right leg. The inside reap puts my opponent on one leg and disrupts his balance, and my forward drive further disrupts his base and balance. To complete the takedown, I drive my head and shoulders towards my right to shift my opponent's weight towards his missing leg and destroying any balance he has left. For the final straw, I drive my weight towards the mat, putting him on his back. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a hip throw when you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances. To set up the takedown, I throw a cross to momentarily blind my opponent and then follow up with an uppercut to lift his chin and increase his elevation. Once I land the uppercut, I move into my opponent sideways. Not only does this allow me to step my right leg deep between his legs, but it also allows me to establish a right underhook and latch onto his right elbow using my left hand. Before I can execute a throw from this position, I first need to execute a back step, which is where I turn my hips away from my opponent and step backwards into him. It's a fairly simple movement. All I do is step my left foot up towards my right foot and then rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction so that my back is pressed up against my opponent's chest. Before he can capitalize on my exposed back, I continue my counterclockwise rotation, elevate the left side of his body using my right underhook, pull down on the right side of his body using my right tricep grip, and elevate his hips using my hips. The combination of these movements is often enough to complete the takedown, but to ensure success, I balance on my left leg and sweep my right leg backwards with authority. Due to my hip rotation and leg reap, my opponent is thrown over my right leg and to his back. It is important to mention that you have two choices when executing this throw. You can either remain standing or follow your opponent to the mat and establish side control. The choice you pick should be based upon your goals in the fight. This is another option when you are standing in opposite fighting stances with your opponent and are unable to step to the outside of his lead leg to set up a takedown. Just as in the previous sequence, I throw a jab to distract and momentarily blind my opponent, and then follow up with a powerful cross. Instead of pulling my arm back into my body after landing the cross, I turn my hand over and establish control of my opponent's right wrist. Forcing his right arm away from his body, I step my right leg between his legs to close the gap between us, drop my level, and then hook my right arm around the inside of his right leg. To prevent my opponent from pulling away, I use my control of his right wrist to pull his body forward. From this position, my goal was to pull my opponent's body over the top of mine. I accomplished this by dropping down to my left knee, lifting up on his right leg using my right arm, and pulling down on his right arm using my left arm. Once I have my opponent hefted onto my shoulders, I dump him over to the mat. The key to being successful with this technique is getting your opponent's weight moving forward, and the only way to accomplish that is to position yourself deep enough between his legs. If you position yourself too far in front of him, you can pull down on his arm as hard as you can and still not get the desired effect. As I mentioned in the introduction to the last section, you never want to shoot in for a takedown without setting it up. There are a couple of effective ways to do this. You can set up takedowns utilizing strikes, or you can set up a takedown immediately after evading one of your opponent's strikes. In this section, I focus on the latter. The goal with most of the following techniques is to drop your level as your opponent's strike comes at you, causing him to miss. Before he can pull his arm back into his stance, you shoot underneath his outstretched striking arm, penetrate past his defensive lines, and seize control of his legs. The most important thing to keep in mind when practicing these techniques is that your first goal is to evade your opponent's strike. If you begin thinking about executing the takedown too early, there's a good chance that you will eat a punch. It is also important not to create patterns. If you drop your level and shoot in for a takedown every time your opponent throws a punch, there is a good chance that he will fake a punch to get you to react. As you shoot in, he throws a counter strike, such as a knee to the face. Again, I have included the combinations that have worked best for me, but it is important that you experiment to find what works best for you. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to counter your opponent's cross with a double leg takedown when in opposite fighting stances. The instant my opponent steps forward and throws the cross, I immediately drop my level to evade the strike, drive off my lead leg, and shoot my weight forward. Next, I shift my weight onto my right knee and slide my rear leg forward into the outside of my opponent's rear leg. With all that momentum moving forward, it becomes very easy to rotate my body in a clockwise direction around my opponent's rear leg. This method of working around your opponent's body for the takedown is often referred to as turning the corner. To obtain control of his body and make the most of my positioning, I quickly wrap my right arm around the front of his legs and my left arm around the back of his legs. Before I can complete the takedown, I first need to secure proper head positioning. Having just shot in, my head is currently positioned to the outside of my opponent's body. Without wasting time, I quickly reposition it to the inside of his body so that my ear is pressed into his stomach. Once accomplished, I have rendered my opponent immobile. To put him on his back, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction, pull his legs into my chest, and drive him in the direction I just came from. Unable to step in any direction, my opponent has no choice but to collapse to the mat. As a rule of thumb, anytime you and your opponent are in opposite fighting stances, single leg finishes will be the easiest to execute, and when you are in the same fighting stances, double leg takedowns will be the easiest to execute. However, breaking that general rule and utilizing techniques such as the one shown here is an excellent way to catch your opponent off guard. In the previous sequence, I demonstrated how to duck underneath your opponent's cross, close the distance, and then turn the corner and complete a double leg takedown. This technique has the exact same setup, but when you tie up with your opponent, you are unable to reposition your head to the inside of his body. Although this head positioning makes it difficult to complete the takedown by driving into your opponent, it allows you to circle around behind his back. However, with your head momentarily positioned underneath your opponent's arm, it is important to make this transition quickly to avoid getting caught in a guillotine choke. Once you've circled around behind your opponent, press your chest into his back to limit his ability to scramble. Next, you must gain control of your opponent's hips. To accomplish this, I unwrap my right arm from around my opponent's waist and hook it up between his legs. With my left arm still wrapped around his left hip, this allows me to clasp my hands together over his left thigh. This grip gives me a lot of lifting power. To complete the takedown, I use my legs to lift his hips upwards and towards my body. As his legs move out from underneath of him, he falls to the mat. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances and he throws a jab. To evade his strike, I step my lead foot to the outside of his lead foot and slip my head to the outside of his arm. Before he can pull his arm back into his stance, I drop my level and shoot in for a modified double leg takedown. To accomplish this, I move my left arm in front of my opponent and wrap it around his right side. At the same time, I drop my lead knee to the mat behind his legs and grab his rear foot with my right hand. To get the takedown, I rotate my body slightly in a clockwise direction and drive straight into him using my left arm. With my right arm blocking him from stepping back and re-establishing his balance, he has no choice but to fall to the mat. In this sequence, I demonstrate a variation of a body lock takedown used frequently by wrestlers. Starting in an opposite fighting stance as my opponent, I drop my level to evade his cross. While his arm is still stretched out, I step my lead foot forward into the outside of his lead leg and drive forward. It is important to mention that I do not drop my lead knee to the mat as I shoot in. Since my goal is to tie him up in a body lock, I keep my elevation slightly higher. However, it is very important that I get my hips lower than my opponent's hips. Once my right foot touches down to the outside of my opponent's lead leg, I skip my rear foot forward. Once my rear foot lands, I step my right foot even deeper to the outside of my opponent's body. This inward charge is not done in steps, but rather one fluid motion. In order to be effective with body lock takedowns, you must close off all space between you and your opponent and achieve chest-on-chest contact. Having closed the distance, I keep my hips lower than my opponent's hips, wrap my arms tightly around his body, press my right ear tightly to his chest, and pull his hips into me. To get a takedown from this position, I have the option of rotating him in a clockwise direction and tripping him over my right leg, but instead I decide to use a slightly unorthodox technique and circle around his body in a counterclockwise direction. Continuing to pull his hips toward me during the rotation, my opponent loses his balance and collapses to the mat. One of the nice attributes about this technique is that it allows you to fall directly into the mount and begin your ground attack from a dominant position. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to block a rear overhand when in an opposite fighting stance as your opponent, and then transition into a takedown that's a cross between an inside leg trip and a leg throw. As my opponent throws the overhand, I elevate my left arm to prevent the strike from landing. Instead of retreating backwards, I immediately step my lead foot to the inside of my opponent's lead leg and wrap both of my arms underneath of his arms, establishing a double underhook body lock. Next, I step my rear foot up to my lead foot and then hook my lead leg around the inside of my opponent's lead leg. In an attempt to destroy his base and balance, I rip my right leg backward, pulling his leg with it. To counter my takedown attempt, he shifts his weight onto his posted leg. Although this makes it difficult for me to finish the inside trip, it allows me to execute a throw. To accomplish this, I keep my opponent's left leg elevated using my right leg so he is unable to replant his foot on the mat, hop on my posted left leg in a counterclockwise direction, and pull my opponent in the same direction using my body lock. With all of my opponent's weight already on his right leg, as he is forced to move more towards his right side, he loses balance and falls toward the mat. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to catch your opponent's rear, mid-level tie kick when in the same fighting stance, and then take him to the mat using an inside leg trip. It is important to mention that if you were in an opposite fighting stance, this technique would be used to catch his lead mid-level tie kick. The first step is to catch the kick. To accomplish this, I turn my body slightly in a clockwise direction so I don't absorb the impact with my ribs, and then drop my left arm to scoop up his leg. Once I have my hand around his leg, I pull his leg upward toward my armpit to disrupt his base and balance. There are many options you can utilize from this position, but here I chose to close the distance and execute an inside trip. I achieve this by slightly rotating my body in a counterclockwise direction, placing my right hand on his right shoulder, and hooking my right leg around the inside of his planted left leg. To send him to the mat, all I have to do is push on his shoulder with my hand and pull his grounded leg out from underneath him using my right leg. The most important part about this technique is immediately attacking with a takedown when you catch your opponent's leg. If you delay, he can throw punches into your face or employ a single leg defense. Personally, I like this technique because it puts your opponent on his back but leaves you standing, which gives you the choice of striking him while on your feet or working to pass his guard to assume a dominant ground position. In this section, I introduce you to the takedowns from the clinch. Although tying up with your opponent while standing can be exhausting work, it is a critical part of the game. In almost every MMA fight, the combatants will tie up at least several times. If you have no idea of how to control your opponent's body, obtain dominant holds, off-balance him, or execute throws, there is a good chance you will either end up on your back or knocked out cold. Out of all the clinching positions, the most prevalent one is the over-under clinch. This is where both you and your opponent have one underhook and one overhook. Because you both have the exact same hold, it's a neutral position. You don't have an advantage over him, and he doesn't have an advantage over you. To start off the section, I demonstrate how to turn your neutral position into a dominant one by pummeling your overhook arm underneath your opponent's underhook arm. This gives you two underhooks, which is often referred to as a body lock, and creates a number of opportunities to attack. However, even when you are a master at pummeling, establishing a body lock isn't always possible. To prevent your opponent from getting the upper hand, I also offer several takedowns that you can utilize directly from the over-under position. A lot of times in a fight, you will end up in the over-under clinch, which is a neutral position because both you and your opponent have one underhook and one overhook. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to pummel your overhook arm underneath your opponent's underhook arm to establish double underhooks, which gives you a more dominant hold. However, as you pummel to steal your opponent's underhook, chances are your opponent will be doing the exact same thing on the opposite side. As a result, you'll end up back in a neutral position. The goal is to win this battle by removing your opponent's underhook without letting him do the same to you. To start this drill, stand chest to chest with your opponent, each of you with one underhook and one overhook. In an attempt to secure double underhooks, back your body away from your opponent and swim your overhook arm underneath of his underhook arm. As you do this, he does the same thing on the opposite side. When one cycle is completed, you will both have an overhook and an underhook, just on opposite sides. When I beat my opponent to the punch, I quickly secure the double collar tie position by wrapping both hands around the back of my opponent's neck, rotate around his body to disrupt his balance, and pull his head down. Instead of trying to capitalize on this position, I return to the over-under clinch so we can continue the drill. sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a shoulder throw when tied up with your opponent in the clinch. To set it up, I slide my right arm underneath my opponent's left arm and establish an underhook, as well as grab his right wrist using my left hand. Once accomplished, I rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction, step my right foot deep between my opponent's legs, elevate his right arm using my left hand, shoot my right arm across his body and up into his armpit, and drop my hips below his hips. Once my back is facing my opponent and my right arm is buried in his armpit, I drop down to both of my knees, rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction, drive my right shoulder towards the mat, and pull down on my opponent's right arm using both of my arms. With my hips blocking his legs, he is unable to step forward and regain his balance. As a result, his body flows over the top of mine and he lands on his back. While it is possible to utilize this throw and remain standing, I have chosen to drop to my knees, put my opponent on his back, and immediately begin an assault on the ground. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a foot sweep when tied up with your opponent in the clinch. To set it up, I rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction and use my right underhook to lift the left side of my opponent's body upward. In order to maintain his balance, my opponent attempts to step his right foot towards the outside of his body. To prevent him from taking that step, I chop my right foot into the lower part of his leg. The combination of my actions causes him to lose his balance and collapse to the mat. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a double leg pickup with slam finish when tied up with my opponent in the over-under clinch. To set it up, I back slightly away from my opponent, slide my left arm underneath his right arm to secure a second underhook, and then quickly drop my elevation and wrap my arms around the back of his hamstrings. If you wrap your arms around your opponent's waist, it will be easy for him to sprawl his hips backwards and prevent you from lifting his body upward. Next, I step my rear leg up to my lead leg, lift my opponent off the mat, and then drive my ear into his ribcage to force his upper body laterally. For demonstration purposes, I lower my opponent gently to the mat, but if you're in a fight, you want to slam your opponent down with your full body weight on top of him, hopefully breaking his ribs as he lands. Sometimes when you are in the over-under clinch, your opponent will clasp his hands together behind your back and drive his weight into you to either execute an inside trip or simply try to bully you to the mat. In such a scenario, this is an excellent takedown to employ. The execution is very simple. Drop my hips, drive upwards with my left underhook, and drop backwards. With my opponent's hands locked together behind my back, his body comes with me. As we fall, I continue to drive upwards with my left underhook and rotate my body in a clockwise direction. With my right leg now positioned between my opponent's legs due to his forward step, he is unable to step his rear leg forward, causing him to lose balance and fall to his back. It is important to mention that what allows me to execute this takedown is my opponent's forward momentum. If he is stationary or moving backwards, this technique will be very difficult to pull off. In this section, I demonstrate my favorite takedowns that are available from the double underhook position. Unlike the over-under clinch, the double underhook clinch puts you in a very advantageous position. With both of your arms hooked underneath of your opponent's arms, you can clasp your hands together behind his back, pull his body into you, and execute all sorts of stealthy throws. I recommend spending some time on these techniques because after working so hard to obtain a dominant position, the last thing you want to do is lose it due to a lack of takedown techniques in your arsenal. Earlier I demonstrated the basic pummeling drill. In this sequence I demonstrate how to use the pummel to establish a double underhook body lock. Here I begin with a right underhook and a left overhook. In order to establish a body lock, I need to turn my overhook into a second underhook. I accomplish this by placing my left palm flat against my chest, backing my left shoulder slightly away from my opponent, and then sliding my left hand underneath his right arm. Once accomplished, I slide my left arm all the way underneath his right arm and then clasp my palms together in the small of his back. I strongly suggest practicing this movement as much as possible. If you are unable to secure the body lock position, the techniques demonstrated in this section won't be possible. Earlier I demonstrated how to close the distance between you and your opponent and execute the inside trip. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to utilize the inside trip when you establish a double underhook body lock. To begin, I switch my stance by stepping my lead foot behind me and yank my opponent's hips towards my hips. As his body is drawn forward, he is forced to take a small step to maintain his balance. Before his lead foot touches down, I hook my new lead leg around the inside of his lead leg. It is important to do this quickly. If you allow your opponent to plant his foot and reestablish his base, it will be much harder to rip his leg out from underneath of him. To execute the takedown, I reap my leg backwards, taking my opponent's leg with it. This takedown is often used in Greco-Roman wrestling and Muay Thai. In both sports, you are disallowed from tripping your opponent to secure a takedown. Tripping is defined as putting any part of your body behind your opponent's body and forcing him to fall over it. This technique is sort of a gray area because you force your opponent laterally and cause him to fall over your lead leg, which is already in place. To execute this technique from a double underhook body lock, I position my lead foot to the outside of my opponent's lead foot. This is a very important step because it will cause my opponent to trip over my leg. Next, I step my rear foot forward, slide my rear knee between my opponent's legs, drive upward with my left underhook, and rotate my body in a clockwise direction. Due to my body lock, my opponent's body is also forced in a clockwise direction. In order to maintain his balance, he needs to step his lead leg to the outside of his body, but he is unable to do so due to my right leg. As a result, my opponent loses his balance and falls to the mat. In today's MMA, being a masterful striker means nothing unless you are able to defend against your opponent's takedowns. If you're killing your opponent in the standing position, chances are he will shoot in for your legs in an attempt to score a takedown. While it is important to be a well-rounded fighter and have a good ground game, the goal is to always control the fight and keep it in your desired realm. If your opponent is beating you on the feet, utilize one of your many takedowns to take the fight to the mat. If you are beating your opponent on the feet, you utilize your takedown defense to keep the fight up. In this section, I cover my favorite defenses to utilize when my opponent shoots in for a double leg takedown. It is important to notice that in most of these techniques, I am not simply stopping my opponent from accomplishing his goal, I'm also making him pay. This is very important because unless you make your opponent suffer for his offensive actions, there is nothing stopping him from attempting takedown after takedown. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for a double leg takedown. Due to our foot positioning, I immediately know that he must position his head on the trailing side of my body in order to execute a successful takedown. To prevent him from sliding his head against my ribs, I place my left hand on his left shoulder and force his body away sideways. This redirects his forward momentum, making it difficult for him to reach my back leg. To make it even more difficult for him to control my rear leg, I then circle my rear leg away from him in a counterclockwise direction. When done correctly, your opponent will either fall to his knees or to his stomach, depending upon his commitment to the shot. Either way, you will be in a perfect position to counter with strikes. However, it is important to mention that circling away from the takedown does not work when you and your opponent are in the same fighting stance as he shoots in for a double leg takedown. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for a double leg takedown. I defend his shot just as I did in the previous sequence, but here I take it one step further by using my positioning to secure a reverse collar tie with one arm and a dominant underhook with my opposite arm. Establishing these grips is an excellent option because it allows me to keep my opponent off balance and land a powerful knee to his face. To execute the technique, the moment my opponent shoots his head towards the trailing side of my body, I place my left arm on his left shoulder to act as a brace between our bodies and redirect his forward momentum. At the same time, I circle my rear leg in a counterclockwise direction to prevent him from latching onto it. However, instead of backing away once I've avoided the takedown, I cup the hand of my brace arm around the back of his head and secure a collar tie. As he follows through with his shot and comes back up to his feet, I use that control to keep his head down. At the same time, I hook my right arm underneath his left arm to secure a dominant underhook. My opponent's natural reaction will be to spin away from my control, but by doing so, he creates space between our bodies. Unable to protect his face using his left arm due to my right underhook, I have a clear path to deliver a powerful knee to his face. In this technique, I demonstrate how to circle out of a double leg takedown when you and your opponent are in the same fighting stance. Unlike when in opposite stances, my opponent shoots in with his head positioned to the outside of my lead leg. To prevent him from latching onto my lead leg, I step my foot backwards in a clockwise direction. At the same time, I place my lead arm in front of my opponent's shoulder to maintain space between us and redirect his forward momentum away from my body. As my opponent comes up to his feet after missing his shot, I turn my arm block into a collar tie, wrap my opposite arm over his shoulder to gain better control of his body, and then deliver a rear knee to his face. In this sequence, I demonstrate an alternate way to block your opponent's double leg takedown. Circling away from the takedown is preferable because it allows your opponent's forward energy to move past you, but sometimes you don't have the proper foot positioning to pull it off. It is important to mention that the technique works just as well when you are in the same fighting stance. To execute the defensive maneuver, I step my rear leg back as my opponent shoots forward. At the same time, I drive my forearms into his collarbones to hinder his forward momentum. As my opponent continues to drive in for the takedown, I step my lead leg back to prevent him from transitioning from a double leg into a single leg, and cup my hands around the back of his head, securing a Muay Thai clinch. Realizing that he will not be able to reach my legs and complete the takedown, my opponent raises up to his feet. Keeping his head down using my grips, I drive my hips forward and land a powerful knee to his face. However, it is very important to make sure your opponent has come up onto both of his feet before launching the knee. If you strike him while he has his hand or knees on the mat, you could get disqualified. This is an alternate method for circling out of the double leg takedown when you and your opponent have opposite feet forward. This version comes into play when your opponent manages to get deep penetration on your body, forcing you to sprawl your legs back to avoid the takedown. However, instead of simply shooting your legs back and flattening your body out on the mat, you rotate your rear leg in a counterclockwise direction as you throw it backwards. This puts you off to the side of your opponent, allowing you to drop your hips to the mat and pin his body underneath you. When you sprawl straight back instead, a lot of times your opponent will continue to drive forward for the takedown. When you sprawl and circle off to the side, his forward momentum will actually take him away from your body. It also makes it much easier to obtain control of his back or work your ground and pound and submissions. As I've mentioned, it's best to circle away from your opponent's takedowns because it redirects his forward momentum away from your body. However, you won't always have the time or foot positioning needed to rotate your body, so it is important to perfect the basic sprawl. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to execute a proper sprawl while shadowboxing. Where a lot of fighters go wrong is they will either jump upwards prior to sprawling or shoot their hips backwards while sprawling. Although both methods seem sound because you're moving your hips further away from your opponent, you actually give your opponent more space to move around underneath of you. If you're up against a good wrestler, he will use that space to continue to drive forward and complete the takedown. The most effective way to sprawl is to send your hips straight down to the mat. A good way to visualize this is to pretend that there are nails pinned to the ground just in front of your feet. Although your feet sprawl behind you as your opponent shoots in, the nails remain in their original position and you want to hammer them downwards using your hips. When done properly, your opponent will get trapped between your hips and the ground. When practicing the sprawl solo, the first step is to plant your hands on the mat and sprawl your feet backward. Envision your chest crashing down onto your imaginary opponent's upper back. Next, slam your hips downward. If your stance is very staggered, chances are your lead hip will have a greater impact on the mat than your rear hip. This is okay. As long as your lead hip is pinned tightly to the ground, your opponent will have a very hard time continuing forward for the takedown. Once you complete the sprawl, how you proceed will depend upon your goals in the fight. If you want to keep the fight on the ground, you can circle around and take your opponent's back. If you want to keep the fight standing, you can quickly pop back up into your fighting stance. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to defend against a double leg takedown utilizing a sprawl, which comes into play when your opponent has penetrated too deep for you to circle out of the takedown. Starting in opposite fighting stances, my opponent quickly drops his level and shoots in. Without hesitation, I shoot my legs back and drive my hips downward. To further hinder his forward momentum, I wrap my left arm in front of his right shoulder and around his neck. At the same time, I wrap my right arm over his left arm and across his chest. It is important to mention that when defending takedowns, you have multiple lines of defense. In previous sequences, I demonstrated how to use your first line of defense, which are your hands. In this sequence, my opponent managed to get past my hands, so I utilized my second line of defense, which are my arms, and my third line of defense, which are my hips. Ending with head control, I now have the option of launching a ground attack or escaping back to my feet. When your opponent shoots in for a takedown, whether it be a single or double leg, the goal is to prevent him from gaining control of your body, which can be accomplished using the techniques presented in the previous section. However, this is sometimes unrealistic. With your lead leg often within grabbing distance of your opponent, a lot of times he will be able to latch onto it with his arms and pull it up to his chest, establishing a single leg position. When this occurs, all is not lost. As you will see in this section, you have many options for not only defending against the takedown, but also turning the tables by using your opponent's positioning to take him to the mat. I recommend practicing these techniques as much as possible because single leg takedowns are quite prevalent. For example, your opponent might shoot in for a double leg takedown, but as you execute your defense and move your rear leg out of his reach, he immediately transitions into a single leg takedown. If you are missing the knowledge of how to escape this compromising position, chances are you will end up on your back. My opponent shoots in for a single leg takedown from an opposite fighting stance, and I defend against the takedown utilizing a technique wrestlers often refer to as the switch. Once my opponent hefts my leg off the mat and secures a single leg position, the first thing I focus on is the positioning of his head. Having utilized proper form, he positioned his head to the inside of my body. I need to reposition his head to the outside of my body, which I accomplish by placing my hands on the right side of his head and forcing his head to the outside. It is important to mention that when your opponent shoots in for an inside single instead of an outside single, you can forgo this step. Next, I reach my right arm over my opponent's right arm, shoot my arm downward and between his legs, and then hook it around the back of his right leg. Once accomplished, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction and lift his lower body upwards using my right arm. This action pulls his center of gravity forward, not only causing him to release his grip on my leg, but also collapse to his knees. This technique is similar to the previous one. My opponent shoots in with an outside single, I reposition his head to the outside of my body, and then reach my right arm over his right arm and then drop it downward. However, instead of wrapping my right arm around the inside of his right leg, as I did in the previous technique, I wrap it around the outside of his right leg. At the same time, I drive my left arm between his legs. This allows me to clasp my palms together behind his right knee. Once I assume this position, it makes it very difficult for my opponent to keep my trapped leg elevated, which allows me to drop my foot to the mat. From here, I increase my elevation, pull my opponent's right leg towards my chest, and rotate my body in a clockwise direction. The combination of these actions turns him upside down and causes him to crash down onto his back. This is an excellent technique because it not only allows you to escape the single leg takedown, but it also puts your opponent on the mat. This technique is very similar to the previous one. The primary difference is your hand positioning. Just as before, my opponent shoots in for a single leg takedown with his head positioned to the inside of my body. To set up the technique, I place my hands on his head and move it to the outside of my body. Once accomplished, the technique takes a slightly different turn. I shift my right hand to the back of my opponent's head and then use that control to drive his face towards the mat. This weakens his hold on my trapped leg and allows me to drop my foot to the floor. From here, I pivot on the ball of my right foot, step my left leg forward, rotate my body in a clockwise direction, and wrap my left arm around the back of his right leg. The next step is to lift my opponent's right leg off the mat, but this can be quite difficult while he still has weight on it. To solve this problem, I drive his head downward using my right hand, forcing him to lean forward. With his weight now off his right leg, I use my left hand to elevate it upward and then continue to rotate my body in a clockwise direction. Due to my actions, my opponent also rotates in a clockwise direction, causing him to trip over my right leg and fall to his back. The key to success with this technique is to drive your opponent's head downward as you lift his leg upward. Without both of these actions, the technique won't work. In this sequence, my opponent shoots in for a single leg takedown, but because we are in the same fighting stance, he utilizes an inside single and positions his head to the outside of my body. His goal is to obtain a high crotch or high C takedown. With my opponent now shooting across my body for the takedown, I am able to hook my left arm underneath his left armpit to slightly slow his shot. This provides the space and time I need to circle step my right foot in a counterclockwise direction and plant it behind his lead leg. This step is very important because it's what will allow me to trip my opponent towards his back. The deeper you can step behind his legs, the better. Once I've completed the step, I slide my left arm underneath his left arm, wrap my right arm over his right shoulder, and then clasp my hands together in the center of his chest. With my grip giving me control of his upper body, I simply fall backwards and rotate my body in a clockwise direction. As I pull my opponent backwards over my right leg and hip, he loses his balance and collapses to his back. The instant he lands, I wrap my left leg over my opponent's left arm, and then hook my left foot underneath his left leg. This position helps prevent my opponent from scrambling and gives me the time I need to secure the top position. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. As he comes forward, I immediately place both of my hands on the back of his head and drive it downward. This makes it very difficult for him to heft my lead leg off the mat and secure the single leg position. It also allows me to step my lead foot to the outside of my opponent's lead foot, destroying his angle of attack. Once accomplished, I continue to drive his head downwards using my lead arm. At the same time, I bend down and grab his lead ankle with my rear hand. To execute the ankle pick, I pull his left leg upwards using my rear hand and slightly rotate my body in a clockwise direction. Due to my actions, my opponent has no choice but to collapse to the mat. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and again he shoots in for an outside single. In many of the techniques already shown, I began by forcing my opponent's head to the outside of my body. I am unable to do that in this situation, so I immediately widen my stance, slightly drop my level, swim my right arm underneath his left shoulder, and then reach across his torso and grab his upper right triceps. At the same time, I reach my rear arm forward and grab his lower right triceps. Once my grips are established, I step my trapped right leg backwards and in a counterclockwise direction. With my opponent clinging to that leg, this movement pulls his body forward. To completely disrupt his base and balance, I continue to rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction and pull his body forward using my triceps grips. With nothing in front of him to support his weight, my opponent collapses to his back. The key with this technique is not letting your opponent lift your lead leg off the mat. If he manages to do this, it will be impossible to circle out of the takedown. It is also important to mention that you should always attempt to force your opponent's head to the outside of your body when he shoots in for an outside single. This will give you a lot more options. However, this technique is good to have in your arsenal when up against a fighter who won't allow you to accomplish this initial goal. In this sequence, I'm standing with my right foot forward and my opponent is standing with his left foot forward. As mentioned earlier, when in opposite fighting stances, your best bet is to shoot in for a single leg takedown. This is exactly what my opponent does. Dropping his level, he shoots in for an outside single on my lead leg. Instead of letting him scoop up my lead leg, I step my right foot behind me before he can close the distance. Determined to get the takedown, my opponent continues forward, but with my right leg now out of reach, he transitions his takedown to my left leg. Due to my reversal of my stance, his head is now positioned to the inside of my body. To use his positioning to my advantage, I slide my left arm in front of his left shoulder, grab his hands to control his grips, and then hook my left leg around the inside of his right leg. To score a takedown, I back my left leg backwards into his right calf and drop my butt straight down. This pulls his base out from underneath of him and collapses him to the mat. As my opponent falls to his butt, I drop my left knee and immediately hook my right arm underneath his left leg. To obtain side control, I rotate my body in a counterclockwise direction, throw his leg over my head, and drop my weight down on top of him. In the previous section, I demonstrated not only how to defend against your opponent's single leg takedowns, but also use his awkward positioning to counter with a takedown of your own. Although all these techniques are highly effective, they won't always be possible, especially when up against a wrestler who is familiar with single leg counters. However, when your opponent establishes the single leg position, it is also possible to counter with a submission. Submissions are illegal in wrestling competition, and they will often catch your opponent off guard. The goal is to apply the submission before your opponent has a chance to complete the takedown. When you accomplish this, one of two things will happen. Either your opponent will immediately submit, or he will put all of his focus into defending against the submission, which requires him to abandon his single leg takedown. In this sequence, I demonstrate how to catch your opponent in a guillotine choke when he shoots in for an outside single from opposite fighting stances. I begin by placing my hands on my opponent's head and forcing it to the outside of my body. Once accomplished, I wrap my left arm over my opponent's head and then hook my forearm across his throat. At the same time, I slide my right hand across the opposite side of his neck and clasp my hands together. To apply the guillotine choke, I stand up tall and drive my arms upwards into his neck. Although the majority of the pressure is applied to your opponent's trachea, which cuts off his air supply, when you apply enough pressure, it also pinches off his carotid arteries and severs blood flow to his brain. Body positioning is very important to make this choke work. Notice how I don't lean my shoulders backwards. A lot of fighters will do this in an attempt to get another few inches of pressure, but this only gives your opponent an opportunity to pop his head out of your armpit and escape. Instead, you want to keep your shoulders forward and finish the choke with your hands. Ideally, you want the bony part of your wrist to be dug into your opponent's trachea. If you position your forearm into his trachea instead, there will be too much cushion, making it difficult to finish the submission. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. Just as before, I place my left hand on his head, but instead of using that hand to push his head to the outside of my body, I use it to drive his head straight back and create separation between our bodies. This allows me to place the outside of my right arm against his left shoulder, hook my right biceps around the left side of his head, and wrap my right forearm around the right side of his head. Notice how this positions the crook of my right arm in the center of his neck. Next, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction so that I can grab my left biceps with my right hand. Once accomplished, I bend my left arm so that my left hand is over his left shoulder. This gives me a basic rear naked choke grip. Just as when applying the rear naked choke, I finish the submission by pinching my elbows together and squeezing my arms. As my arms drive into his carotid arteries, blood flow to his brain is severed and he taps out. This technique is often called the executioner choke, and there is a reason. It's very powerful. However, the instant you apply it, your opponent will most likely release your leg and begin fighting your hands to break the choke. Even if he manages to break your grip, you still manage to escape the single leg takedown. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. However, immediately after closing the distance, he realizes that my rear leg is within reach and reaches for it with his rear arm in an attempt to transition into a double leg. To begin my defense, I place my hands on his head and move it towards the outside of my body, just as I would when defending against a regular single leg. Once accomplished, I grab my opponent's right wrist with my left hand to break his grip on my rear leg. A split second later, I hook my right arm underneath his right arm and then grab my left wrist with my right hand. This provides me with a Kimura lock and gives me complete control of my opponent's right arm. To use my control to score a takedown, I jerk his right arm upward, breaking his grip on my rear leg. At the same time, I rotate my body in a clockwise direction. As my opponent's arm folds behind his back, it puts a tremendous amount of pressure on his shoulder, forcing him to roll his upper body forward to relieve the pain. Continuing to crank on his arm, he eventually does a front roll and lands on his back. Rather than let my Kimura lock go when my opponent lands on his back, I maintain my grips to prevent him from scrambling. Once I'm hovering over him with my lock intact, I have a couple of options. I can drop down and finish the Kimura submission, drop down on top of him and obtain side control, or back away standing. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he drops low and shoots in for an outside single. Immediately, I place my hands on his head and drive it downward. This is an excellent defense because where the head goes, the body follows. With his head being pushed towards the mat, it makes it very difficult for him to elevate his hips and finish the takedown. Next, I move his head to the outside of my body. At the same time, I create separation between our bodies by taking a backward step with my rear leg. Once accomplished, I step my left leg in a counterclockwise direction so that my weight is directly over my opponent's back. This allows me to reach my left arm underneath his left arm and grab my right instep, trapping his head between my left arm and right leg. Due to this trap, as I execute a forward roll over my left shoulder, my opponent comes with me. As I pull my opponent on top of me, I already have the triangle position. My right leg is wrapped around the right side of his head. By gripping my right instep with my left hand, I have trapped his left arm to the left side of his neck. To finish the triangle submission, I hook the crook of my left leg over my right foot, pinch my knees together, and squeeze my legs. It's not the easiest technique to execute, but if you manage to pull it off successfully, it will be on your highlight reel forever. In this sequence, my opponent and I are in opposite fighting stances, and he shoots in for an outside single. Just as with the previous technique, I immediately place my hands on his head and drive it downward to prevent him from elevating his hips and completing the takedown. Once his head is positioned down by my lead knee, I remove my rear hand from his head and post it on the mat. Balancing all of my weight on my lead leg and left hand, I elevate my rear leg off the mat and shoot it behind my opponent's lead leg. Notice how I rocket my body forward as I do this so I can trap the back of my opponent's lead leg with my left hip. Still applying downward pressure to my opponent's head using my right hand, I corkscrew my body toward my back. This drives my right leg into my opponent's hips, causing him to fall backwards over my left leg. Unable to regain his balance by stepping backward, he crashes down to his back. Although I too am on my back, my opponent's lead leg is trapped between my legs, allowing me to quickly lock in a knee bar. To apply the submission, I wrap my left arm around the back of his Achilles tendon and then wrap my right arm over my left arm. This arm positioning allows me to pull his leg into my chest. It also allows me to position the toes of his foot against the side of my face, which will hinder him from rolling out of the submission. To apply the knee bar, I bridge my hips and hyperextend his leg.